Hello my loves, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the start of what I hope is going to be a new series on my channel if I keep up with it. So in today's video what I'm going to be doing is explaining the entire plot of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol to you so you don't have to read it. And I wanted to turn this into a bit of a series specifically with classic books. I can understand that some people might not love that idea because classics are classics for a reason and we should encourage people to read them, and I do agree with that. However, I have some thoughts on this and why I wanted to do this challenge. So if you don't care about why I'm doing this and you just want to discover the plot of a Charles Dickens book, I'll put a time here. Similarly, if I do keep up with this series and you'll just come back and watching an old one, you're probably very familiar with this. So again, go to that time and that'll be when I actually start talking about the book. So very quickly, like I said, I do appreciate that classics are classics for a reason, and I have been enjoying my foray, my adventures, my dippings into classics. I have. However, it took me a long time to actually start to even consider reading classics, because for me personally, and I feel like a lot of people, the first time we're introduced to classic literature is when we're at school. And personally, I don't think that introduction is particularly helpful, and I think it actually puts a lot of people off reading classics and makes them quite inaccessible. Even without that, I think a lot of classic books are very inaccessible to a lot of people anyway, and they might want to know the story or they might hear a lot of good things about it and want to be able to discuss it, but actually it's not everyone's cup of tea to sit and actually concentrate and try and work out what these really old words mean, or follow along with the changes in language that have happened over the time that actually make them quite difficult to read. So for me personally, I feel like when you're introduced, especially in an educational setting, to classic books, we're taught to read them in a very specific way. We're taught to interpret them in a very specific way. It's that cliche thing of the authors said the curtains are blue so they're sad, where actually it almost dampens our own interpretations and enjoyments of books, because we're not reading those classics to enjoy them, we're reading them to hit certain marks on an exam, and therefore we don't enjoy them, and that can turn a lot of people off of them, which I completely get because I was one of those people. So what I kind of wanted to do was, for those people who want to know the stories of classics or want to be able to pretend they've read them and live their best Richard Papin life, here you go. You can pretend you read them and discuss them with people. I want to read more classics, and I feel like this is a good motivation for me to read them so that I can talk about them, because at the end of the day, I fucking love talking about books. Why else do I have this channel, And one of my favourite videos that I've done so far is the one where I discussed Dracula. Now, these videos are going to be very different. I am not going to really be discussing themes or my views on the book. I am, for the most part, literally just going to be telling you the plot. I may at times input a little bit of it because I can't help myself, but for the most part, it's just going to be what happened. Here are the facts of the story, so that if you want to pretend you've read it, you can, To sum up, I don't think literature and classic books and all of that should be held behind a gate where you feel like you have to have a certain level of literacy to be able to read them. I think everyone should be able to know those stories, so I'm providing that for you. If you don't like that, that's absolutely fine. This series isn't for you. No problem. I doubt that many people will care anyway what I'm doing on this tiny little channel, but oh well. Without further ado, let's get into it. So today we are covering A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This wasn't the book that I originally wanted to start this series with, but actually I'm kind of glad it is, because it's relatively short, so I don't think it's going to take us much time to go through, and it is the season. I'm planning for this video to be uploaded on Christmas Eve, so it just felt appropriate for this to be the video that is the first one, if that's when I'm planning on starting it. Before I do get into the explanation of this book, I would just like to say, if you want a fun overview through singing of A Christmas Carol, I would really recommend watching Star Kids A VHS Christmas Carol on YouTube. I'll put a link down below because it's fantastic, and I had actually watched that before I read it, and it helped me a little bit with picturing people and making sense of things. So if you want a fun brief overview that's not loads of talking, go watch that. Just go watch it anyway, it's really good. And also, because I love Star Kid and VHS Christmas Carol so much, I will be using their cast as the pictures of the characters today, because that's how I imagined them all as. Stave 1, or Chapter 1, Marley's Ghost. We start the book discovering that someone named Marley is dead. There is no doubt about the fact that he is dead. We then discover that Marley was the business partner of our main character, Scrooge. And then this first chapter is really us learning Scrooge's problems, or learning the flaws of Scrooge and learning his character. So after we've been told that Marley's dead, we are then transported to the business that him and Scrooge owned together. And I will be completely honest with you, I think it was explained what their business was, potentially very briefly, but I don't really remember what their business was, other than that Scrooge has quite a bit of money. Whatever Scrooge's business is, he now owns it alone. He has just one other employee called Bob Cratchit, who is someone who will come back more currently, so we will find out more about him later, but it's just important to know at the moment that Bob works for Scrooge. So in this first chapter, essentially Scrooge is just working for a lot of it. He's in his office. We get a very, as you do with Dickens, you get a very bleak picture of the building that they work in. There's not enough coals in the fire, so it's freezing. You know, there's people outside cheering and happy because Christmas is coming, and inside it's just quiet, dark, cold, miserable, essentially. And that is the whole theme here, is that Scrooge is miserable, and therefore he makes everyone else miserable around him too. He's quite demanding of Bob Cratchit. He doesn't let him put more coals on the fire to make it warmer, and he also seems quite annoyed about the fact, or doesn't seem, is very annoyed about the fact that Bob wants the next day, which is Christmas Day, off to spend with his family. He's very frustrated that he's expected to pay him even if he's not working, and then you could, if it was up to Scrooge, Bob would work every single day of the year, fuck his family, essentially. So we learned that relationship there, that he's not the kindest or most compassionate boss. And then there are also a couple of other wealthy businessmen who come into the shop, and they are talking about trying to get some revenue to invest some money into increasing welfare for the poor, the sick, the people who need it, who can't work. And this is when we get another show of Scrooge's character, because his response is essentially, have they run out of space in prison? Have they run out of space in the workhouses? They can just go there. They don't need my money. Or even if they do, I'm not giving it to them, is essentially his response to these businessmen. And they are, you know, understandably a bit offended and not very happy with that, but they just kind of leave. The only other person we then meet who comes into the place of work is Scrooge's nephew. I don't remember his name. Did we find out his name? I don't know. So Scrooge's nephew comes in, he's inviting Scrooge over for Christmas, which we get the impression he does every year. And Scrooge, as always, says no. He's quite rude to his nephew. In fact, he's talking very much about the fact that he doesn't understand why everyone loves Christmas. It's crap, it's not enjoyable, it's stupid, people shouldn't be happy about it. And his nephew is actually pretty calm, doesn't get too offended. He's probably quite used to his uncle at this point, but he basically just says, you know, if you want to come over, you can come over anytime, and then he leaves, and that's it. So that is Scrooge's work day. He then comes home, plans to have some gruel for dinner because he's cheap, so that's what he's eating, and basically just go to bed and, you know, not celebrate Christmas the next day. When he gets home, however, what actually happens is he starts hearing noises. He thinks he hears someone in the cellar at the bottom of his house, and he goes to investigate, but he can't find anything until eventually he's in the living room, I think, and the ghost of his business partner, Marley, who, as was very well established at the beginning of the book, is definitely dead, is in his room. Scrooge is understandably terrified. It's an emotion we see very early on in the book that you wouldn't expect to see from him based on his previous behaviour. You would expect him to be miserable, doesn't believe in ghosts, angry, but he's genuinely terrified. So Molly sits down with him and, is quite calm and collected for a ghost. He seems a bit sad. He has a lot of chains tied to him, chains that are made up of things like padlocks, money. I don't think they're made of money, but the chains are made of things that represent his negative qualities or flaws or things he did wrong in his life, essentially. And through talking to Marley, when Scrooge sort of calms down and is able to have a conversation with him, he discovers that Marley in death is essentially doomed to walk the earth, burdened by these chains because of the things he did wrong in his life. And he has essentially come to warn Scrooge that the same thing will most likely happen to him unless things change, unless Scrooge does something different. So he basically explains to Scrooge that there is a chance that he could escape this fate, and that in order to help him escape that, 3 spirits are going to visit him over the next 3 nights. So the first one will appear the following night at midnight, and then the following night after that another one, and so on. So for 3 nights, he's going to be visited by 3 different spirits. After this, Marley flies out the window. Scrooge very briefly sees loads of other ghosts outside of his house, all of them miserable, moaning, whining, because they are all doomed to that same fate. And then he takes himself up to bed, tucks himself in, and essentially falls asleep, just dreading the visits of these next 3 spirits. Stage 2, or Chapter 2, the first of the 3 spirits. So Scrooge wakes up to the sound of the bells chiming 12, which he's very confused about because he fell asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. So he is very confused and thinks he has slept through the entirety of Christmas Day. He also then realises if it's striking 12, that means the first spirit is about to appear, and he gets quite scared again. He's in his bed, he's in a 4-poster bed that has curtains, and the curtains pull back with a ghostly hand, and here is the first of the 3 spirits. We discover that this is the ghost of Christmas past, and she is here to take Scrooge down memory lane a little bit, show him some things from his past, but also from other people's pasts, other people that are important or relevant to him. We don't know this at the time, but this is with the intention of teaching him certain lessons. So firstly, she takes him back to the town that he grew up in, and immediately Scrooge is recognising everything. You start to almost immediately see a different side to Scrooge because he's quite excited, almost he's reminiscing quite a lot about remembering all of these places and this town that he was a child in. And he sees some children, running around, they're all playing, having fun, enjoying new things that they've got on Christmas Day. And then we see Scrooge as a child sat by himself and generally being left out or sort of feeling quite miserable. And when Scrooge sees himself as a child quite, lonely and looking quite miserable, he starts to feel guilty about actions he's taken in the past towards other children. So he thinks back to a caroller coming to his door and him just slamming the door in their face and not giving them the chance to say in it. So he's already starting to see or experience some emotions that I suppose he probably hasn't in quite a long time. We then go to the boarding school that Scrooge was sent to, where it seems like he's kind of just been left there on his own over Christmas. But then his younger sister comes to collect him, and it's more happy, and he's excited to see her, she's excited to see him, and she's basically saying she thinks that their dad will now let him stay at home and he won't have to come back to this boarding school. And you get the sense that Scrooge as a child was very miserable in that boarding school. And then after Scrooge and his sister have left the boarding school, the spirit is just having a bit of a conversation with Scrooge, the current Scrooge, and we discovered that his sister actually passed away and just had the one child, which is obviously Scrooge's nephew that we met in the first chapter. We then skip to a Christmas quite far in the future. Scrooge is a young man, he's just started working, and we see him at the Christmas party that his boss is throwing, where he's an apprentice learning how to do whatever it is in business that he does. And it's a really fun party. The boss is really generous. There's food and drink, and he's getting everyone to dance and sing and inviting, people in who don't even work there. And, Scrooge again is reminiscing about how much fun it was and the fact that he was a good boss, and generally feeling quite nostalgic, quite positive emotions about these memories. We then start to sort of shift into some more negative memories though, so the spirit starts to take him down some less happy times. And the next memory we see is him again a little bit older, and he has a partner named Belle, and she's breaking up with him, essentially saying that he's different. This essentially seems in the book to be where he's changed, and he's starting to be more like the Scrooge we saw in the first chapter, where he's more focused on money and business, and he's not sort of compassionate towards others. So Belle is essentially saying he's changed, and she doesn't think it's fair on either of them for them to stay together. Scrooge, the present day Scrooge, not the one in the memory, is quite upset by this memory, doesn't want to see it anymore, and asks the spirit to move on. Then finally the spirit takes Scrooge to a point in Belle's future, actually, where she's married, she has children, and her husband comes home and says he saw Scrooge sitting on his own in his shop. And we discover this is at the point where Marley's dying, and it's kind of implied that the husband is surprised that Scrooge is on his own, and either not with Marley or not with some kind of, family or support on Christmas Day when that's happening. Scrooge then decides he's had enough. He doesn't want to see any more of the past and be reminded of these things. So he takes the hat that the spirit is wearing, which seems to be controlling the powers of moving through memories, and Scrooge is transported back to his bed. Stave 3, or chapter 3, the second spirit. So Scrooge had fallen asleep, and he wakes up again to the bells chiming to indicate it's already time for the second ghost. So he's in a bit of a time loop. It's almost like he's sleeping through entire days, and then suddenly it's time to meet another spirit. So he's again, he's quite scared again of meeting another spirit, especially remembering the way the last one appeared by just sort of drawing back the curtain. So he tries to prepare himself this time, and actually the spirit appears in a different room, so he has to sort of get up and go find him. We discover this is the ghost of Christmas present, so he's going to be taking Scrooge through current happenings of Christmas, and the spirit seems generally more happy, more joyful than the past spirit. So first, the spirit just takes him out into the city. Scrooge sees people happy, laughing, clearing snow, children playing in the snow, people trying to get their last minute bits of food for the Christmas dinner, and just generally, being quite happy that it's Christmas Day. They then go to Bob Cratchit's house. Bob, remembering, is Scrooge's assistant, and Scrooge discovers that Bob has quite a big family, quite a few children, and one of them, who is named Tiny Tim, is really unwell. He's weak and fragile and small, and it's clear that the family, but Bob specifically, are really trying to look after him, but they're just really struggling because they don't have the money to do that. There is a bit of discussion around Scrooge himself, Bob's wife specifically, quite angry, understandably so, about Scrooge and the way he treats Bob and how much he pays him, and how they're really struggling to get by while Scrooge is really rich and, affluent, especially considering they've got quite a sick child. Scrooge instantly feels quite bad about this, and he's talking to the spirit about what will happen to Tiny Tim, and the spirit essentially says if nothing changes, if things keep going on like they are, then Tiny Tim's gonna die, which Scrooge is quite upset by. Bob then proposes a toast to Scrooge, you know, saying, this is the reason we can buy all of this because he pays me. But the whole family just generally gets quite somber at the mention of Scrooge's name. The sort of happy Christmas spirits get dampened a little bit, and you can see the influence of Scrooge's presence, personality, just name, just from it being mentioned there. They then move on to go and see what Scrooge's nephew is doing for that Christmas, and they find, you know, everyone's quite happy, there's family around, they're eating, they're playing games, and Scrooge really gets into this. Even though no one can see him in sort of the spirit world that he's in, he enjoys it so much and gets so into it that he's trying to join in with the games and call out answers to questions, even though no one can hear him and he can't actually participate. But it's, again, a very different emotion and look for Scrooge. He's sort of warming up and starting to become a more happy version of himself, I suppose. Again, they toast to Scrooge. There is mention of him, and in one of the games they sort of slightly take the piss out of him, but it doesn't have the same dampener on the mood that it does at Bob Cratchit's house. And again, his nephew is generally quite calm and as forgiving as possible towards his uncle. Then at that point, some children appear. And this is, I'm looking at my notes, I don't really remember this part very well. I had to go back and read it, and it's quite different to all the rest of the parts. But essentially what I understood from it is there are two children. I don't think they're real children. Scrooge asks, who are these children? Are they yours, spirit? And the spirit basically explains they're humanity's children. The girl is named Want and the boy is named Ignorance. I think that's the right way around. And basically warns Scrooge against these things. So they're more there, I think, as an embodiment of human fault, but specifically Scrooge's faults. And he's basically advising him, especially don't be ignorant to the plights of others, essentially. And he mimics Scrooge's words back to him when, you know, Scrooge asks, you know, is there no one to help these children? The spirit mimics his words back to him that he'd spoken to those wealthy investors in the first chapter, saying, are the prisons all full? Are the workhouses all full? So that's then another point of Scrooge sort of learning to, or trying to teach Scrooge to be more understanding, or at least think about people in different situations to him. And that's kind of the whole point of Christmas Present. Day 4, or chapter 4, the last of the three spirits. So the last ghost is scary. So Scrooge is almost quite, he's got used to things at this point. He goes to sleep again, wakes up to the bells, losing hours of time. But he's almost, you know, he's on the last spirit, he's in the groove of it. Yeah, he's still quite scared, but it's not quite to the extent he was at first. However, this spirit is almost described as quite death-like or quite Grim Reaper-like. Shadowy black cloak, a hood over his face, never speaks, doesn't say anything, just points at things, and his hand is described as quite like deathly or something. So Scrooge is like, you know, come on, I know the drill by now, let's get this over and done with, let's go. But he is quite off-put by this spirit in particular. And this is the ghost of Christmas Present. So these are things that are yet to come, may happen. If things continue the way they are, will happen, essentially. So he's taking Scrooge into the future. So just like the second spirit, the ghost of Christmas Present initially takes Scrooge into the city. And the first thing Scrooge sees is some quite wealthy businessmen talking about someone who's died. And they're clearly talking about another business person. And there's no feelings lost over this person who's died. They're not particularly sad about it. No one really wants to go to the funeral. They're kind of saying, I will if I have to, or, you know, if you guys do. But they don't really seem to care about this person that's died. And it's quite obvious to us that it's Scrooge that's died, that the spirit has taken him into the future after his death. But Scrooge doesn't get this. Scrooge is very stuck on the fact that he's learnt these previous lessons. He's feeling bad for Bob Cratchit and wants to help him and his family. He feels bad for that child he turned away, and he wants to help children and, you know, not be so mean to him. He wants to spend more time with his nephew. So he's of the belief of, well, the spirit's going to show me what's going to happen now I've learned everything. And he doesn't realise this is almost more of a warning. So he has no idea that the person these businessmen are talking about are him. Next, the spirit takes him to, I don't really know where it was. It was just quite a rundown place. I was imagining it as Fagin's gang house from Oliver. But there's a man there who seems a bit shady. He's buying and selling things that are stolen. And there's essentially 3 people who come in and they're selling looted possessions from the person who's just died. And Scrooge is just thinking, God, this is awful. You know, 1, this poor man, 2, who would do this? And he still hasn't worked out that it's him that has died and they've just stolen all of his things to come and sell, because he hasn't left anything to anyone. He just hoarded everything and didn't leave a will or, you know, leave anyone to inherit it. So they've just gone and stolen it to sell it to make some money. And they're almost quite boastful about it. There's a woman who stole his bed curtains off his bed while he was still dead in the bed, and she's quite, you know, proud of that and, like, yeah, boastful about it, I suppose. And so it again becomes clear that no one really cares about the fact that he's died. They're just getting his stuff so they can get some money, you know? The spirit then takes him to his deathbed, but Scrooge refuses to pull back the cover on the body's face. He still doesn't realise it's him, but he doesn't know what he'll see and he doesn't really want to see it. The spirit tries to persuade him quite a lot to open it, but Scrooge just flat out refuses. And so the spirit just decides to move on. So they then return to the Cratchits. Tiny Tim is not doing good. Tiny Tim is on the verge of death and probably will be dead quite soon. We see Bob very upset, crying, and just, yeah, generally very sad, understandably, about the fact that Tiny Tim is most likely going to die very soon. And there's then a mention that Scrooge's nephew has offered to help them in any way he can, whether that be money or whatever. He gave him, I think he gave the Cratchits his business card or something so they could contact him. So they're sort of talking more so about how generous the nephew has been, and there is no mention of Scrooge at all. Finally, the spirit takes him to a graveyard to force him to confront who has died. Scrooge is quite scared about approaching the gravestone because he doesn't know who it's going to be, and there's sort of just a general feeling of dread for him. But then he sees that it's his gravestone and he realises it's him that's died. He then has a bit of a panic because, as I said, he thought, well, I've learned all these lessons now, so things are going to be different. You know, he thought he'd given up his business and gone off somewhere, and that's why he wasn't there and no one was mentioning him. But now he's discovered he's dead and no one cares. So he's asking the spirit, is this definite? Are things going to change? Can I do things to make this different? Or is this just inescapable? But the spirit doesn't talk, so it doesn't say anything. It just sends him back home. Day 5, or chapter 5, the end. Scrooge wakes up, and bearing in mind he's been waking up at midnight every night for the past 3 nights, he's very surprised to discover it's actually still Christmas Day, and he lost no time from seeing all these spirits. So that all happened in some weird mystical time realm where time doesn't pass, or it passes weirdly. He's really happy to discover it's still Christmas Day. He's jumps out of bed, completely different man, over the moon. He hangs out of his window to shout at a child that's down in the street to check that it's still Christmas Day, and when he discovers it is, he asks the child to go and get the biggest turkey he can get from the butcher's and send it anonymously to the Cratchits so that they have decent meal, good food to eat on Christmas Day. He then gets dressed, goes out to just sort of walk around the city. He bumps into the businessmen from the first chapter who were trying to get him to invest in better welfare for the poor. He essentially apologizes to him and invites him to come back into his office another day so they can talk things over properly. The businessman is quite surprised by this but very happy, and as Scrooge then continues on his way and is generally just spreading cheer. So he goes to church, he walks around, says Merry Christmas to people, pats children's head, that kind of thing. He's just very relieved to be out of the spirit time loop, and also to feel like he has a second chance to prevent all of those things happening. He then goes to his nephew's house and has a really nice Christmas with them. You know, I suppose similar to what would have happened in the spirit world. He eats with them, drinks with them, sort of stays up quite late with them for the party, and just has a really nice day. And then finally we see him the next day at work, where Bob Cratchit has come back, and Scrooge thinks he'll be really funny and pretends to be like his normal grumpy self for a while, and is like having a go at Bob Cratchit for being like 10 minutes late to work. But he actually then gives him a raise, and is, you know, really nice to him. After being like, oh, I'm just joking, it's okay that you're late. His raise essentially is what he does. And then we don't really, like, scene wise, we don't see anything else, but we're told that Scrooge continued to help Bob Cratchit's family, Tiny Tim didn't die, and that Scrooge essentially becomes a second father to Tiny Tim, so that's quite cute. He continued to be more generous, more happy, more positive, and a lot of people were quite surprised in that change, but that didn't really bother him. The people were suspicious or didn't understand it. He learnt those lessons and kept to that change, and it was a happy ending for all, essentially. That is A Christmas Carol. It was quite an enjoyable read, I'll be honest. Quite short, nice Christmas story, you know, it's a classic. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not really going to be discussing my personal thoughts on these books. If you do want to know what I actually thought about this book though, like what I rated it, my thoughts on the characters, the themes, the writing, all of that, it will be in my monthly wrap up, because obviously I read it this month. So that's not up yet. It's not going to be up when this video goes out, but once it is, I'll put a link down below and you can go and find it on my channel if you would like to see my thoughts on that. There are no other videos in this series at the moment. I have, like I said, done a sort of discussion of Dracula, which is kind of similar, but the way I explained the plot was not as coherent as this was. So if you are interested in hearing me discuss more classic books, I will link that video as well. But otherwise, that is all I have for you today. So I hope you enjoyed this. If there are any particular classic books you would like me to read and explain, please let me know, because I have quite a few that I've already read that I'm planning to do, but there are a lot that I need to read. So if there are any particular ones you need to know the plots to for school or something, I can't promise I'll get it up that quickly, but let me know. And if you are watching this around the time it goes out, I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, Happy New Year, all of that. Have a good rest of your day for now, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.